May I now invite Dr. Somdata Karak to introduce the guest speaker, please.
Mental health. Mental health problems are all pervasive. Beyond age, beyond gender, beyond geographical, socioeconomic backgrounds, it manifests in multiple forms and impacts all. Our understanding of the biology of mental health is still in its growing phase, and yet the number of things that we know have to be tried on ground. And of the things that get tried on ground and the ones that are impactful need to be implemented in policies. And now if you think that each of these is an independent field in itself, you are very, very right. And hence we are very thrilled to have Professor Vikram Patel among us today as one of those who have been able to connect research, healthcare and policies all together. Maybe that's what visionaries are able to do, to be able to see things that others still cannot. As a student, when others around Professor Patel thought he would pick to study neurosurgery, he chose psychiatry. As a psychiatrist, he chose to dwell on the problems of those who do not have access to psychiatrists, a situation which is well too common in low and middle income countries. Then as a psychiatrist turned clinical scientist, he chose to look at mental health as a public health issue, a move that has been instrumental to bring the topic to a common man's daily discussions and destigmatize the issue. Through his work on connecting mental health with violence, addiction, to connecting struggles of adolescents or old age people, to founding of Sangat, an NGO based out of Goa, which works at the grassroots in different facets of mental health, Professor Patel is a book in himself to be read. And today, we are here to hear some of those stories out. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together to invite on stage Professor Vikram Patel.
Much for that lovely introduction. I have to say that was the nicest introduction I've received in a very long time. Usually when people read introductions, they go through a whole big long biodata. So I want to thank the lady who made that introduction for actually having understood a little bit about what I do and making it so intimate and personal. I really appreciate that. I'd like to start by thanking also the dean of the center. I came here 10 years ago. I remember that was an event on the genetics of complex diseases. And it's a real pleasure and an honor to be invited to come back here today and give this Foundation Day lecture. Now, I have worked in the area of mental health spanning very many different aspects of this incredibly broad discipline. I worked, for example, a lot on child development and early brain development. In particular, I lead a translational neuroscience platform that involves about 12 institutions in India and abroad that is trying to figure out new technologies to assess brain development in very young children, all the way from that, which is fairly basic science, through to working at the coalface on how one can deliver mental health care in parts of our country, in fact in most parts of our country, where there are no skilled mental health professionals. So I thought long and hard about what it is that I wanted to speak to you all about today. And I consulted Giriraj as well about this topic because there could be so many things I could talk about, and I decided to speak about this topic, issue of young people's mental health in our country. And the reason was, of course, partly because a lot of my work over the last 2 decades has been focused on adolescents and young adults, but also, of course, because many of you here are young adults, this being an educational institution. I thought this would be something that would be very relevant to many of you here. And I think many of you of my generation, the faculty, the teachers here, would have children in homes, either children who were once young adults or who will soon be young adults. And this might also be something that would be of great concern to yourselves. So you're not going to hear about genes, cells, or molecules in my talk, but instead you're going to hear about perhaps a little bit about circuits, but mostly about people and about society, and particularly the society that we have created for our young people today. And I want to start off with perhaps something that should worry each and every one of us in this country, something that we probably see almost regularly every other day in our newspapers. These sorts of stories have now become very, very commonplace. It's not uncommon, you know, to wake up in the morning and open a newspaper in India today, and of course this particular one comes from this very city. It's not unusual to wake up one morning and you just see these kinds of stories. We've almost become become very used to these sorts of stories, almost as used to, for example, reading every morning about how a bus went down a ravine and 30 people died. I write regularly in the Indian Express, and I remember once when the latest NCRB, which is the National Crime Research Bureau data, came out, and we discovered that the number of people who die in road traffic accidents on one day in India is greater than the total number of people who've died due to terror incidents in the last 10 years. And it just gives you a sense of how public policy is actually influenced in our country. It isn't really influenced by facts any longer, but by other things. And of course, here is another example of a daily tragedy that's played out in our country, and as you will soon see, there is virtually no real action on it. The common thread to all these suicide stories, and I've been really working very hard at this, and I'm going to move away from suicide in a moment and talk about mental health more broadly, but suicide, of course, is the canary in the coal mine. It's a reflection, ultimately, about the mental health of a population, and in this particular instance, the population of young people in India. The common thread through all of these stories, through many of them, isn't that these are young people who come from very impoverished backgrounds, or young people who are completely unemployed, or young people who are living on the margins of society, but actually these are highly educated young people, most of whom are in universities that we die to get into. The University of Hyderabad, for example, the IITs, medical schools around the country. These are talented young Indians from all corners of the country, and obviously I think we'll all agree that if you end your life, you obviously have lost hope for the future. Now, let me just get down to some science now. In this case, the science comes from epidemiology, the actual observation about the numbers of people affected by a health condition. The most reliable, or one would think the most reliable, routinely collected data on mortality due to accidents, injuries, and suicide in India is produced each year by the National Crime Research Bureau. The latest data until, in fact, just last month that we had on the NCRB was for 2016, but this particular study that I'm reporting was the one that I led, that was published, that reported on deaths in the year 2014. Sorry, 2012. And this was that in the NCRB 2012, that's a mistype, there were 60,000 young Indians who had killed themselves in that year. However, in collaboration with the Registrar General of India, the RGI conducts something called the Million Death Study. This is actually a rather scary sounding study, but what it really describes is the cause of deaths that occur in 1 million randomly selected households distributed across the country to give you a representative picture of why Indians die across all age bands and across all causes of death. When we looked at the Registrar General of India's data, the NCRB data comes from the coroner. They are police statistics, whereas the the RGI data comes from verbal autopsies. So every time there is a death in a household, there is a trained enumerator who goes to the household and does a verbal autopsy, and through that information, two physicians will then look at the report and come to an analysis of what the cause of death was. In fact, we found that in the same year that 60,000 deaths were reported in the NCRB, actually almost double the number of deaths of young people were reported through verbal autopsy. Last week, I was with a group of colleagues who are working with the government of Gujarat in a particular district of Gujarat, where they have done a surveillance system for counting all the suicides occurring in the Mehsana district in Gujarat. And she was telling me, Dr. Lakshmi Vijay Kumar from Chennai, who is one of India's leading suicide researchers, that the number of suicides they're counting through on-the-ground surveillance is 3 times actually the numbers that are being reported in police thanas. So it's a very, very big crisis. But what is really important about this crisis, and what is perhaps quite unique to our country, is that this crisis particularly is a young person's crisis. Here I want to show you the data from a Lancet paper from 2012, which looked at the age standardized suicide death rate across the age spectrum here for countries that are classified as high income. This is in the purplish line or pinkish line, and this is India, and this is for men. And what you can see here is that in most countries in the world, the developed countries in the world, suicide mortality usually rises with age and then peaks in old age. This is a typical pattern. Not in India. In India, actually, suicide mortality peaks in young adulthood. And in young adulthood, the difference in the suicide mortality rates between high-income countries and India is twofold for men. What about for women? Well, this is what it looks like for women. In Western countries, as you can see again, a gradual increase, but of course much lower than for men. But look at this. For women in India, in young women, the rate of suicide is 6 times that of any developed country. Last year, my colleagues Lalit Dandona, Rakhi Dandona, and others from the Public Health Foundation of India updated these suicide data and actually published this was a paper that hit the headlines in many of the national newspapers. You might have seen this in the Lancet Public Health. And here what I'm about to show you is their estimation of the proportion of all suicides that happen in the world that happen actually in India in the 2 genders. So let's first look at men. In the year 1990, just under 1 out of 5 of all suicide deaths globally occurred in India, in men occurred in India. By 2016, this rate had gone up to a quarter. For women, it was even more astonishing. From a quarter of all global female suicide deaths, India today accounts for 1 in 3 of every woman who will kill herself on the planet. Now, of course, India is a very populous country, and so one may think that actually these proportions are reflective of the actual contribution that India makes to the overall population of the world. So let's look at what that proportion is. Well, for men, as you can see, it's only about 15%, and you can already see the divide here growing. And for women, of course, it's an astonishing divide. Indian women account for about 17% of the world's women, but a third of all the women who kill themselves. The Dandonas also replicated a very important finding from our 2012 study, showing that most suicides in India cluster around the age group of around 15 to 30. And indeed, in this particular age group, suicide is not only now the single most common cause of death in young Indians, and if those of us who, it doesn't matter what perspective of science we take, whether we're concerned with genes or we're concerned with public health, we're concerned with things that we can do to prevent premature mortality. And I would hope that at least in part, some of you would be inspired to start turning your attention to understanding why we have such astonishingly high suicide rates, the highest in the world really, that all cluster around this very critical age group of between 15 and 40. In fact, if you look at the NCRB data, you'll see that suicide has been in the top 2 causes of death in young people for more than 10 years now. It's reached the #1 cause in the last 3 years. And it's going to stay there, because of course, we're doing nothing to actually stem this tide. There's another very peculiar thing about suicide in India. Whereas most causes of death cluster around the Bimaru states, which was given by economists, not by me, the states of northern India, peculiarly suicide clusters in the most developed states in India. Does anyone know which part of India has the highest recorded suicide in the country? Which state or union territory? Any guesses? It's Puducherry, right here on the east coast of Tamil Nadu. It's got the highest suicide reported rate in India, but also Telangana and Andhra Pradesh. This map was drawn before the bifurcation, but you can see that actually this region is also, much like its southern neighbors, got amongst the highest suicide rates in the country. And it's a very peculiar pattern here. You can see from the north going to the south, it gets denser and denser. And ironically, Bihar, which probably has the worst mortality rates due to any other health condition, actually has the lowest mortality rate due to suicide. And so these are questions. These are just questions that we need to begin to interrogate. What is going on in the most developed, the most educated, the most socially advanced states in India that is driving young people to kill themselves? So let me turn to the second kind of scientific inquiry, which is to understand the problem. The first kind of scientific inquiry is what is the scale of the problem? For that we use epidemiology. But the second kind of inquiry is to understand the problem. Certainly a lot of the work we heard about from the dean earlier about CCMB is really about that, to understand the mechanisms of the problem. I'm not going to touch so much on brain mechanisms, although I will say a little bit about that, but instead really talk much more about the social mechanisms through which young people might be killing themselves. But first we have to start with the brain. Now, many people think that this is an issue of only modern times. And many people think that this is because young people, those of us who are parents of adolescents, will probably completely be in tune with this kind of description, that they are passionate, irascible, and apt to be carried away by their impulses. That it's a problem of modern times, and teenagers these days, or young people these days, are just simply like JNU students constantly wanting to get into fights. But actually, this particular statement was written by Aristotle many millennia ago. This is not a characteristic of modern times. In fact, it's a characteristic of our very evolutionary biology. Perhaps the best book I think I would recommend to anybody who wants to understand the incredible new science of the incredible new brain science that makes us understand the nature of adolescence, I would turn your attention to this wonderful book. It's a great example of popular science written by a great neuroscientist. How you can communicate very complex ideas to a lay audience, but in this particular case also making it very accessible to perhaps the most important audience of all, parents of an adolescent and a young adult. So I'm going to actually use the same kind of idea, boiling down a very complex body of developmental science into something that I hope will be accessible to many of you here who may not be developmental neuroscientists. And to do that, I'm just going to show you one very concrete example of how our understanding of the adolescent brain has transformed. For a long time, when I was a medical student, we were taught that the adolescent brain was just simply either a big kid's brain or a very small adult brain. That it was somehow just one of the other, but it wasn't in itself a very unique phase of neurodevelopment. We now know, and it's only been about 10 or 15 years that this knowledge has become very clear, mainly through novel neuroimaging techniques, that in fact that is not the case. The adolescent brain is one of the most dynamic stages of brain development across our entire life course, and it is very unique to that particular stage of our life course. In what way? Well, this is a slice of the brain. And what you can see here is the red area of the brain. This is the deep structures of the cortex, the limbic areas. These are the areas of the brain that are associated with a range of emotions that are characterized by rage, joy, fear, excitement. You won't believe this, but cognitive neuroscientists actually, this is a technical term, refer to these as hot emotions. Now, the limbic cortex is where these raw human emotions, the primary emotions, are actually experienced. Now, what's so special about this? What's special about this is that this part of the brain achieves full maturity around the ages of 12 to 15, around puberty. But this part of the brain, immediately behind our forehead, the prefrontal cortex, actually matures 7 to 8 years later. That is important because it tells us that the part of the brain that is associated with executive functioning, the part of the brain which enables us to pause and think before we act, matures 6 to 8 years after the part of the brain that tells us to act now in response to one of these primary emotions. This is why young people are likely to be much more impulsive, act in response to environmental triggers without really thinking about their consequences, and as a result, often land up engaging in behaviors like lighting up a cigarette, having sex without thinking about wearing a condom, driving fast without wearing a helmet, or trying to hurt yourself because you're upset without thinking what might be the consequences of that. And this is why most risk behaviors and health-related behaviors that ultimately in later life will cause damage have their onsets during adolescence. Now, even before neuroscientists came along, one person understood the unique nature of adolescent development more than 70 years ago and put it into all his movies. That was, of course, Walt Disney. You think about every single Walt Disney movie, almost every single, there will be a lead character who is an adolescent animal or human. Consider The Lion King. All of you, well, most of you, I'm assuming, have seen these movies. Simba, the lion cub, when he grows into a young lion, not yet a fully grown lion, but not a baby lion, is being groomed by his father to become the leader of the pride, and his father tells him, you must not go to the edge of the forest where your uncle Mufasa lives, because that is a place of danger. And of course, anyone who knows, seen the movie will know what exactly Simba does. He does exactly that. He goes to the edge of the forest because he is a teenage lion. What about Nemo? I'm sure many of you have seen Nemo, right? What does Nemo do? His dad tells him, do not go up to the surface of the ocean because that's where the fishermen will come and you'll get caught. Of course, that's exactly what Nemo does. And then what about Mowgli? Mowgli, of course, is so happy in his jungle with Baloo the bear, in spite of all the dangers, the python, Sherba, all of these people out there who want to eat him, but he's so happy in the jungle, he's not going to leave, except when he goes down to the village river and he sees, and of course you know what happens next. Walt Disney understood the adolescent brain so very well. We as scientists only discovered that 15 years ago. So what does this all mean? That young people across all species, well certainly all primate, mammalian species, and of course the human species, are biologically and evolutionary primed to take risk and behave impulsively. This is part of our DNA, if I can use that particular word in this institution. Of course, this offers very important survival advantages, as all evolutionary factors are. This is about survival. Why? Because by taking risks during this phase of life, when we are still relatively protected, because we still live with our parents, we learn from those risks. We learn about the essential lessons that we will need to know when we become independent of our parents and have to bring up our own families. That is how it is an evolutionarily important step. But obviously, if I behave impulsively in the face of social stimuli, it also poses very specific vulnerabilities for me when I'm in this particular age group. And that is what we need to really be thinking about when we consider why do young people behave impulsively and take risks. Last year, 30 scientists and myself, I led this in the Lancet Medical Journal. We published a major commission on understanding mental health, reframing our conversations on mental health. And I will touch on two particular aspects of this new way of thinking about mental health that I want to share with you today, which I think is very pertinent if we are going to understand how mental health plays itself out in the population, but particularly in young people's lives. The first is understanding the nature of mental health from a way that is convergent, that unites our biology with our environment. There's no question, of course, that genes are very important, but I kind of think of genes very much as the frame of a painting. It's the outer boundaries of what we can achieve in our life. In certain circumstances, for example, in certain kinds of genetic conditions, the frame is very small. For example, Down syndrome. There is a limit to what we will be able to achieve and learn in our lives because of a profound genetic abnormality. But the vast majority of us, our genes will play a relatively minor role in the way that our mental health will evolve during life. What will be very important is a series of developmental cascades. Of course, genes influence the developmental cascades, but what really influences those developmental cascades is the social environment. I want to talk about three kinds of neurodevelopmental cascades that happen across our life course. The first is plasticity. This is a really interesting notion, and I love to communicate this to school students. So, plasticity, of course, the word plastic comes from the fact that when you press a plastic, it takes the shape of the pressure. And this is exactly why neuroscientists call this phase of brain development as plastic. Why? Because our brain actually gets molded by our environment. It's probably the most sensitive organ in our body to our social environment. Perhaps the next comes our muscles, because we can actually mold our muscles by going to the gym and make them larger. But in fact, literally, you can do that with your brain as well. One of the best examples of such a plastic brain is the one that comes from the London taxi driver study. I don't know how many have heard of this particular study. London taxi drivers, the ones who drive these famous black cabs, way before Google Maps came into being, to be a London cabbie was extremely difficult. You had to have a map of every single lane and road in the city of London imprinted in your brain, because there were no other maps, there were no computers, there were no phones. And it was an extremely difficult exam to pass. So these scientists at University College London, the new neuroimaging techniques were just beginning to become available in the early 1990s. This was structural imaging using MRI. They asked the question, were there physical differences between the brain of a London cabbie and an age and residence matched control group? And they hypothesized that if the brain was truly plastic, then the part of the brain that is associated with spatial mapping, figuring out where you are, should show physical differences from those men who were not cabbies. So they did this study, and they found exactly that. The size of the brain, that particular section of the brain associated with spatial orientation, was about 50% larger. That's good news for those of us who are in our 20s and 30s. But I will tell you one thing, that in fact, it's good news for those of us who are older too, because the brain is plastic all through life. This is why when you have a stroke, if you think about it, why do we get better with physiotherapy or speech therapy? It's not by magic. It's really because, in fact, you're building and creating new circuits to actually, as it were, bypass those that have been damaged. But it is most plastic in the first 2 decades of life. A second very important neurodevelopmental process, and I've already mentioned this, is the fact that there's rapid pruning. That is to say, the brain achieves its biggest mass in the first few years of life, and then it loses a lot of its mass. And it does that because parts of the brain that are not needed actually shut down. That's called pruning, and that's also a very important developmental pathway. And I've also talked about differential maturation. And the third, of course, is cell death, which, as you see, begins to escalate really as you grow older. Now, these are normal neurodevelopmental pathways that I've showed you across the life course. Now, what I want to show you is the period of peak incidence of mental health problems in the life course. The environment, of course, plays a very important role, and this is the period of peak incidence. And as you can see, it almost perfectly maps over these neurodevelopmental processes. The only way that we can today understand why mental health problems are the leading cause of sickness in young people, the leading cause of death in young people, and why most mental health problems begin in young people is actually by taking account of these neurodevelopmental processes. So what are these environmental factors? I'm often asked this question, particularly by parents who are very concerned, but of course this concerns all of us as Indians. One of the most important ones is experiences even before you become a young person. This is really important for those of us who are working with young people to keep in mind. In the West, for example, these days, it is very common to say that all healthcare should be trauma-informed. What does that mean? It simply means that when you see a 20-year-old in front of you who is behaving or experiencing things that are distressing, pause for a moment and remember that they may in fact be experiencing things that may have begun very early in their lives. Because we now know that adverse experiences in childhood, neglect, maltreatment, a variety of kinds of experiences actually affect the brain when it's most plastic. And it is only in adolescence and young adulthood that the consequences, either because of inflammatory pathways or because of the impact of those experiences on cognitive development, actually then begin to emerge in the form of mental health problems. In adolescence and young adulthood itself, violence, substance use, discrimination of various kinds, and we see a lot of that in this country, but also peer influences. This is another very important and very unique aspect of development when you're a young person, is the fact that when you're a kid, the most important influences are your parents. When you're an adult, the most important influences are societal, people you work with. During this phase, between childhood and adulthood, the most important influences are your peers, other people of your age. And that's very, very unique to adolescence. And again, it's an evolutionary characteristic. Now, when I was a kid, and I'm sure this applies to many of my fellow colleagues here who are faculty, my peer influences were the kids in my building. The kids in the building that my parents lived, these were the same kids I would get in the bus to go to school. These are the same kids who went to the school. All the kids in the school were a lot like me, and we came from very similar social backgrounds. And in the evening, when I came home from school, I played with the same kids in the car park downstairs, hockey or cricket. Those were my peer influences for pretty much my entire life, until I turned 23 and left India for the first time. But today, my son's peer influences are the virtual world. He will sit in front of a computer and through social media will be comparing himself with other young people from places and lands that he has never even been to. He will be comparing himself with other young people who he has never even met. And so you can begin to see that if, from an evolutionary perspective, when we are adolescent, we are comparing ourselves with other people, and that is evolutionary what we do. With social media now, there is no boundary with whom we are comparing ourselves, and therefore the threats to our self-esteem become all the more greater. This is not just speculative. There is now some very scary new evidence that is emerging, particularly from the US, where this research is getting a lot of pace, demonstrating the strong relationship between the amount of use of social media and poor mental health, and indeed also cognitive function, particularly in adolescents. And then there is, of course, this other issue, which I think is very much a reflection of the rapid social change that's happening in our country. And this, I believe, also explains why suicide is commoner in South India. And that is to do with the fact that aspirations that you have in more developed parts of this country are different. But the social orthodox world that young people often find themselves in remains unchanged. And so, therefore, the risk of being disappointed in your aspirations being crushed is far greater in Andhra Pradesh or Tamil Nadu than it is in Bihar. And of course, these particular stories really speak for themselves about the crushed aspirations of many young people, either because of their gender, their caste, or simply the fact that they haven't been able to achieve the kind of educational aspiration that their parents wanted, and ultimately that they wanted. Now, many of you have heard about Kota, of course. It's an infamous name now in India, in educational circles. This is where kids go before they get into places like CCMB or IIT or medical school. And of course, it's regularly in the newspapers because they go to these tuition factories, to study, to get into these institutions. This story by Snigdha Poonam was probably one of the best news articles that I read about what goes on in Kota. And I actually then excerpted one of the last bit of that news story to illustrate the kind of crushed aspirations for so many young people in our country. This particular quotation captures it best. Kumar doesn't see himself as an IIT type guy. I could do with a theoretical kind of education like geography or a BSc in maths. My parents had permitted me to do it, but family friends said, no, send him to prepare for engineering. Going back means I am wasting a lot of their money, he added. They will feel sad, but they will not say anything. We're economically not that well off. My father runs a general store back home, but they have always spent on my education, perhaps because they expect I will do something for them in the end. But what is it that he wants to do? I asked him now that he was in the mood to talk. Never thought about that, he said, eyes to the floor. I have never felt that free. And it is something that really, as an adult Indian, as a parent of a 22-year-old who's actually a stud student of wildlife biology at NCBS in Bangalore, it gives you pause to think about the kind of society that we live in, that we have created for a young person to voice these sorts of sentiments. Or for a kind of society where young people kill themselves simply because they chose to love someone that they were prohibited from loving. You know, if you look at the NCRB data, you will find that love affair is actually the second leading cause of suicide in young people in India. These are some of the examples of what those spurned love affairs are about. This is not about being jilted by your lover. It's actually very often about being prohibited from actually loving the person of your choice. So I want to, before I move on to something, the third part of my talk, which is about what can we do about this, I want to just say that promoting youth mental health is everyone's business. This is not just about the mental health professional, because the mental health professional cannot fix such a complex story. Of course, the mental health professional has some role to play, but it is actually the responsibility of everyone in this room, every parent, every young person, to actually see this as a crisis that affects the future of our country. If we all agree the young people of our country are our future, well, then it affects the future of our country. 2 or 3 years ago, on behalf of the World Bank, I put together a whole team of scientists looking at the evidence of effective interventions for the full range of brain disorders, mental disorders, substance use disorders, and neurological disorders. This is called the Disease Control Priorities Program. And then I want to just show you, we distilled a lot of evidence and looked at what is really strong evidence for scaling up. And this is how we organize the evidence in terms of the environments that young people experience. The first environment, of course, is at home, and this is particularly important for childhood. We must begin to recognize that the health that we enjoy as adults owes its earliest origins to the days that we were infants. And this is not only about the nutrition we receive as infants, it's actually about the love and attention we receive from our parents. And by love and attention, I don't mean some middle-class fantasy idea about love and attention. I mean just basic emotional needs, responsive parenting. And many, many, many parents in our country have very scarce personal resources to do that. It requires a very robust social welfare system to ensure that parents are able to provide nurturing environments in their home. But of course, there are also certain environments that are positively toxic and harmful, and we have to protect children from that. In educational institutions, and hopefully CCMB is an example of one, where such practices are going to become the norm if they're not already the norm. Helping young people learn problem-solving skills so that while the prefrontal cortex is still taking its time to evolve and develop and mature, we're able to develop emotional and social competencies to help young people deal with disappointments in ways that don't harm themselves. Promoting healthy school environments and access to better mental health care in the schools, in the institutions, not asking people to go somewhere else, but actually making these services available in a non-stigmatizing way in the institution. And of course, as members of a broader society, I think we all have a role to promote progressive attitudes about many things, but especially, I would say, for young people about sexuality. Engaging and addressing issues that concern young people. I think many of you will know, actually, I split my time, half my year in India and half my time in the US. In the US, suicide rates in young Americans have doubled in the last decade. It's one of the greatest national crises in the US right now. They've also gone up 50% in young people in Britain. So this is by no means a purely Indian tragedy. It's actually happening in many parts of the world. No one understands why. People are grappling for trying to figure out what is going on in the brains of young people that is leading them to reach such depths of despair. But certainly these are issues that are also being highlighted, that young people in many parts of the world are losing hope in their future because the future looks much bleaker for them than it did for their parents. And one way that is playing out in America right now is that the generation of young adults today is the first generation in 100 years that will earn less than their parents' generation. And this is, of course, many of you will have been reading about the age of despair in America, and that is really also partly to do with economic despair, about the likelihood of future prosperity. So the second important message I wanted to give from the Lancet Commission is that in order for us to start framing our conversations of mental health in a more broad way, we need to go beyond mental health being equivalent to a biomedical mental disorder. We need to actually appreciate that mental health is a human attribute. It is on a dimension. If you look at the findings from neuroscience, there is no clear line through which you can divide people up into two groups, people with mental health problems and people without. Actually, that's an interesting historical story. How did we land up with a classification system that divides people up into binaries? You have a disorder and you don't. Well, it comes from the fact that this is a model of taxonomy or classification that works really well with infectious diseases. You can really neatly divide the world up into people with the flu and without, with TB and without. But you cannot do that for people with mental health problems because there is no biological line that divides people with and without. And in fact, many of you struggle with understanding the genetic basis of mental illness. In part, the problem is your phenotype actually doesn't exist in the way that it has been supposed to exist for 40 years. There is no clear-cut diagnostic phenotype. And this is one real important reason why we need, in our science, to begin to recognize that mental health is a continuum. It is a continuum, and we have to study mental health as a dimension. Each and every one of us right now is somewhere on this continuum. And each and every one of us at some point in our life may move up and down that continuum. When we are at different stages of the continuum, we can do different things to help prevent, promote, protect, and recover. And of course, promotion is something that can happen across the continuum. I want to now end off by just telling you a little bit about local work that I've been doing in Delhi and Goa and Bhopal in Madhya Pradesh, in Bihar, that illustrates how we have translated some of these ideas into action. These are, in the Lancet Commission, the major kinds of public health interventions that we identified are built on very strong science, randomized control trials, and implementation science that demonstrate how we can achieve a better future for our young people by taking a much broader dimensional perspective on mental health, not just thinking of mental health as mental illness that requires a very particular clinical intervention, but a much broader set of interventions that also seek to build skills, protect, and promote. So reconfiguring care from clinics to communities, recognizing that frontline care must be delivered in community-based institutions and largely consists of psychological and social interventions delivered by teachers, by peers, by community health workers. A lot of my work in India is with ASHA workers, for example. Involving the target community in planning and delivering care, and the most important target community here is young people themselves. And using digital tools. I work a lot with digital technologies, and I'll give you one example when I describe the case study, but actually a lot of my work now is embracing digital technologies in very innovative and diverse ways. And in fact, I do think that this is another great example of how different sciences can come together. For me, data sciences and digital sciences offer a real opportunity to leapfrog some of these very important questions on understanding mental health. So I want to finish with how we translate these very high-level ideas into my third kind of science, which is implementation science. How do you go from epidemiology to understanding the etiology, and finally, how do you actually respond to the problem with practical actions? Over the last 5 years, largely with support from the Wellcome Trust, which I must acknowledge up front, I've been a principal research fellow of the Trust for the last 3 years, but before that for 10 years, I was a senior research fellow, and then before that for 5 years, a career development fellow. So the Wellcome Trust has supported me since 1998, continuously till today. And I owe a lot of the work that I've done in India thanks to the Trust support. But I've also been supported by many other funders, the NIH and so on. But this particular work has been done largely in schools. So, kids who are a little bit younger than the ones who will be doctoral students here. But I think many of the principles are actually very similar. And so thinking of the dimensions that I showed you earlier, we work at the whole school environment to promote social environments that are safe, non-violent, where young people feel they belong, where young people feel they actually have agency. We work in the classroom to develop greater awareness of mental health, and then we provide a range of interventions both through face-to-face counseling as well as digital smartphones to help young people build problem-solving skills. Again, remember the scene in my life, there are government schools, large schools, some with as many as 2,000 children with about 5 or 7 teachers, and really with very, very, as you can imagine, poor quality education infrastructure. And yet we were able to show that by the simple simple act of getting these students involved in activities that they prioritize. For example, it could be as simple as cleaning the schoolyard. But of course, more profound things, for example, addressing gender-based violence, and addressing teacher violence actually, and things like that, that we could produce profound improvements in well-being and reduce violence. The first paper was published in the Lancet last year, and the second one, which is a 2-year follow-up, is being published in PLOS Medicine as I speak, demonstrating the very large impacts in this extremely underprivileged community in Bihar of this very low-cost intervention of just targeting the social environment of the school. The next is the classroom-based intervention, which is to start conversations amongst young people about mental health. And here I'm going to show you a video. This is a video we co-produced with 15-year-olds in New Delhi government schools. Remember that the word mental health in Hindi often translates into pagal. And with something like that, you're not going to get very much engagement with young people. So you really have to actually change the narrative in a language using words that young people can actually relate with. And so over nearly, I'd say, 6 months, we co-produce a script with young people and then produce a cartoon that we use. Our moderators, our facilitators go into the classroom at the start of each school term and run this particular 2-minute video, and then have a guided discussion with the young people to talk about, because by simply talking and being aware of your mental health as you are about your physical health, we believe that that alone is a very important way to achieve good outcomes.
मानसिक स्वास्थ्य क्या होता है? हम जब मानसिक स्वास्थ्य की बात करते हैं तो मन में तनाव या खुशी या गम जैसे फीलिंग्स आते हैं, या फिर डिप्रेशन और बाइपोलर डिसऑर्डर जैसे मेंटल इलनेसेस के बारे में हम सोचते हैं। हमारी जिंदगी में कई उतार चढ़ाव आते हैं और हम हर दिन नई प्रॉब्लम से जूझते हैं। प्रॉब्लम्स जैसे फ्रेंड्स हमारे कपड़ों का मजाक उड़ाते हैं, किस स्टाइल से बात करते हैं या कैसे चलते हैं। प्रॉब्लम्स जिनका हमें कोई अंदाजा नहीं होता, जैसे किसी फ्रेंड या फैमिली मेंबर की मृत्यु, कोई बुरा या मुश्किल ब्रेकअप या किसी बुरे अपमानजनक रिश्ते में उलझना, या एग्जाम्स या एंट्रेंस में फेल होना। हमारे बड़े होने के साथ साथ जो जिम्मेदारियां आती है उनसे जूझना। अच्छा मानसिक स्वास्थ्य या मेंटल हेल्थ हमें जिंदगी की इन छोटी और बड़ी प्रॉब्लम्स का सामना करने की ताकत देता है और फिर से जिंदगी में पूरी तरह से शामिल होने में हमारी हेल्प करता है। इसके बिना जिंदगी इतनी सुंदर और उज्जवल नहीं लगती। आज खराब मानसिक स्वास्थ्य युवाओं के अनहेल्दी होने का सबसे बड़ा कारण है। किसी से इस बारे में बातचीत करना मदद पाने का सबसे पहला स्टेप है, और जब अपने फ्रेंड या कोई फैमिली मेंबर को मदद की जरूरत हो तो उनकी बात संवेदनशीलता से सुननी चाहिए। कभी कभी हम ऐसी फीलिंग से डरते हैं, शर्मिंदा होते हैं, लेकिन हमारा मानसिक स्वास्थ्य बहुत जरूरी है। चलो इस बारे में मिलकर बात करते हैं। आज तुम कैसे हो?
So the idea is that what we do is we go into the schools, we run this classroom session, and obviously we then expect kids, if they want counseling, to come and see the counselor. Well, two things happen. First of all, nearly 15% of the entire school body turned up, and obviously we had to rethink how we would approach this particular vast demand for counseling. And so I'll show you what we're doing now with a digital tool which we can scale up at a much higher level. But initially we had started with just a face-to-face counselor, a lay counselor from the local community who was trained in a particular technique called problem solving. I'm not going to say much about this because the randomized controlled trial has just been completed in New Delhi schools. It's a very brief intervention involving 4 or 5 sessions over 2 to 3 weeks, and there's a cartoon booklet that is associated with it called POD, that is to say, plan, identify your problems, identify the options to deal with it, and then do it. And it's essentially in the form of a game. Which is really the way you want to engage young people, but it uses a very well-defined technique called problem solving, which is intended actually to help young people to build that executive functioning skill, to actually deal with the kind of things that happen in every young person's life, but to prevent them from escalating into self-harm behaviors. Here is the primary outcome. These are fresh results, which, as I said, we're just writing up now. This was our primary outcome of the youth top problems, and you can see the red line is the counselor delivered intervention. The blue line is the usual care, which was just getting the booklet but without the counselor, and you can see a separation which is clearly statistically significant. And you see similarly also for the mental health scores, a separation which starts growing with time, which also indicates actually very, very reassuringly that the skills that were built with this very brief intervention begin to have incremental effects as you follow these kids up. I want to show you now another video that it describes the experiences of 3 or 4 of the kids in these New Delhi schools who received the counseling.
मैं जॉब करता हूँ, इस चक्कर में थोड़ी पढ़ने में प्रॉब्लम होती थी और टाइम नहीं मिल पाता बिल्कुल भी पढ़ने का, जिस वजह से मुझे स्कूल में सर्दियों की भी थोड़ी सी मतलब काम पूरा होने पर सुनना पड़ता था, वो सब होते।
टेंशन में कुछ भी हो सकता है, बंदा कुछ भी कर सकता है, इंसान हाथ कट कर सकता है। आजकल तो फांसियाँ बहुत ज़्यादा लगा लेते हैं बच्चे।
इस एज में ना दिमाग उड़ता रहता है हवा में, वो समझ में नहीं आता, ना पढ़ाई में दिमाग लगे ना घर में दिमाग लगे।
काउंसलिंग के बारे में हमारे स्कूल में बताया गया था और हमसे पूछा गया कि अगर आपको किसी भी तरह की परेशानी है तो आप ये फॉर्म फिल करके दे सकते हैं काउंसलिंग का।
हर हफ्ता मैं वहाँ जाता था तो वो मुझे कुछ ना कुछ प्रॉब्लम से रिलेटेड समस्या मतलब सुधारने के लिए कुछ आइडिया देते थे, टिप्स देते थे कि कोई भी हमारी जो समस्या होती है उसे सॉल्व करने के लिए पहले कई अन्य तरीके जितने तरीके हो सकें सॉल्व करने के, वो तरीके निकालो। उन सब तरीकों में से जो सबसे बेहतर तरीका हो उस पर मतलब काम करना चाहिए, हमें ध्यान देना चाहिए।
कि अगर हम मान लो बातों से समझाएं तो बच्चों को मुझे लगता है उतना ना समझ में आए, तो अगर बुक के माध्यम से समझाते हैं, स्टोरी के माध्यम से, तो बच्चों को रियलाइज़ होता है कि हाँ कि अगर इनके साथ प्रॉब्लम है तो मेरे साथ भी हो सकती है। तो बच्चों को कहीं ना कहीं समस्या चुनने में और समझने में भी हेल्प मिलती है बुक के माध्यम से।
कोई होता है ना, कोई चाहता है कि मेरी प्रॉब्लम कोई और दूसरा नहीं बस वही सॉल्व होए, कि कोई एक ही को पता हो, तो उससे वो मैं काफ़ी अच्छा बेनिफिट है कि मैं कोई प्रभाव नहीं पड़ता उसको।
काउंसलिंग का सेशन आता गया 3-4-5 सेशन तक मुझे ये अच्छा लगा कि बच्चा यहाँ पर आके जो पीओडी तकनीक हम सिखा रहे थे उसे अब उसने सॉल्व करा और उसे सीखकर जो उसके गुस्से की प्रॉब्लम थी अब वो बहुत कम हो गई, तो बहुत अच्छा रहता है, रिलैक्स रहता है, क्लास के और लोगों से भी बात करता है। और ये फीडबैक मुझे उसके क्लास टीचर ने भी दिया।
से अपना प्रेजेंट अच्छा करके चलेंगे, हमारा फ्यूचर भी अच्छा ही जाएगा।
फ्यूचर में कोई भी समस्या आती है तो जो काउंसलिंग मुझे सिखाया गया था प्रॉब्लम को सॉल्व करने का, उन्हीं तरीकों को मैं अपनाऊंगा।
ये ज़्यादा गुस्सा है तो मतलब क्या बोलते हैं उस टाइम मतलब पढ़ना नहीं चाहिए, कोई अच्छे शांत जगह मतलब बैठ के ठंडा दिमाग हो जाएगा तो उस तब पढ़ना चाहिए। ये सब अभी तक ये
जो टाइम टेबल बना था ना उसके हिसाब से चल रहा हूँ तो घर भी सही है और पढ़ाई भी सही है।
मेरी प्रॉब्लम तो गुस्सा और वो कंट्रोल हो चुका है।
So we got so many kids coming and so many kids loving it. There's no way we can have counselors doing all of it. So over the last year, we decided to take this entire experience of problem solving, which by the way, it sounds like a very simple thing. It's actually got a long history in behavioral science. To see whether we could develop for this particular age group a game that could be delivered in computer labs in the school, almost as something that was universal, rather than just wait for kids to come if they have problems. Really see this as a basic life skill. And so over the last year, we've been actually working with kids. This is mostly now, this work is happening mostly in Goa, where we have now developed the app in English and Konkani, and now we're adapting it in Hindi. And we've just completed our first pilot studies with 300 kids. We've been astonished by how enthusiastic these kids are. Not surprisingly, it's often the first time that these kids are playing with smartphones, but also they're actually playing a game. This is a game that's delivered in exactly like the counseling sessions is delivered in 4 computer labs. And with each session, they actually play a game that is teaching them skills that improve their executive functioning. And this is actually another short video that actually is a little bit of a promo for that game.
Pod Adventures, a game to learn stress management and problem solving. Hi, I'm Nisha, and I will be your friend and guide through this game to learn new and fun ways of solving your problems and managing stress. Do you think solving your life's problems can be an adventure? It can, with the exciting new things you will learn in this game. With each gameplay, you will step into the shoes of other characters and explore their worlds. Complete missions to help them solve their problems. Practice ways to feel less stressed. Relax and find your happy place. Work on your problems in simple steps. Create an action plan and track your progress. Learn, practice, and master.
So I want to end now by just saying that these examples I've given you, changing the environment, equipping young people with skills for problem solving, is not sufficient. We also have to remember the larger societal issues that young people face. And in order to address those, we have to work directly with young people, and we have to engage them in what I believe is ultimately a national conversation around the kind of society that they want to inherit from their parents. So as part of, again, another Wellcome Trust funded public engagement program, we've been very fortunate, in fact, to have a sequence of grants from them, which is not related to science at all, but communicating science with young audiences. Where we have been working for the last many years to develop a range of different media products, including a website called It's Okay to Talk. You can actually type that in. There's also a Hindi version of it. You can go and look at the website, and this is about getting young people to actually disclose and share stories about resilience, about struggle, about recovery, as a way to actually get them to also talk about the bigger issues that matter, the kinds of issues that I showed you in some of those newspaper articles, the larger social and structural factors that ultimately really create such despair in the lives of some young people. But of course, the majority do find ways around that. And those are the stories of hope and resilience that we want to bring to the surface so that we can inspire those young people as well who are facing difficult times. This is my last slide. The guiding principles for action then, my friends, for the work that I do with young people, and I think the work that we should all be doing with young people, is first of all restoring hope in their lives. For the future is always going to look much better than it does look like now. Building skills, particularly to do with executive functioning, and I think we need to be guided by the incredible advances in cognitive and behavioral science to enable us to think about what those skills are and how to deliver them. Enabling evidence-based care, it is absolutely the case that there will be some young people who have very significant, remember the dimension I showed you? Well, I haven't really touched on the extreme end of the dimension, which is when you develop a very significant mental illness. For those young people, enabling care for that mental illness is just as important as prevention, and empowering those young people to engage with the issues that matter the most to them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Patel, for an inspiring and excellent presentation. With your kind permission, if we can move on to question answer session. May I request Dr. Chandak to join on dais, please?
And I think you build up the story very well. I'm sure there will be a lot of questions. So please raise your hand, identify yourself, and I'll request everybody to be brief and to the point regarding question. Yeah, Nagraj, take the mic there. Yeah. और माइक नहीं है क्या?
Yeah, excellent talk. I really enjoyed it and very.
Mic close to your mouth.
Hello, is it okay? Okay, I just have a question. When you talked about families, there could be children who have been in families where they are taken care of and a lot of love and affection, okay, children. But when they find that their parents are involved in extremely atrocious activities, would it affect their mental health? I can give you one example in Nazi Germany, for example. All these SS people are very affectionate parents. You know, there's no problem at all. But many of them, when they realize that this thing had serious mental problems later, what do you say about that?
Yeah, so I think many parents often ask me this question. You know, I never, ever forced my son or daughter to join IIT. I wanted him or her to do whatever they wanted. The problem with young people, and I want to just remind you of what I said, is that the biggest pressures on young people are no longer coming from homes, they're coming from their peers. And actually, we as parents are increasingly just bystanders watching our young people's lives shaped by forces that you and I don't even have a remote control over. It isn't the case as when I was a young person, when my parents still were very much the main social environment. As I said, I gave you the metaphor of my building. You know, that was my world. It ended with my building, you know, where all the other kids who went to school in the same school as me lived. But you and I are living in a world now where young people's social world, we are not even part of that anymore. So that's the one thing. But the question you asked is also about what we do at home and what we do in society cannot be seen as separate things. I think if we are able to show love and compassion to our kids at home, we need to be able to extend that love and compassion to strangers out in the world around us. Because if we create a hateful society, it will affect our young people. No matter how much love and compassion we give at home, if we believe that that is the only influence on their well-being, then we are wrong. It is the broader society that we allow ourselves to be part of that actually has a far greater influence on their well-being.
Thank you.
Yes, Sondatta.
Engagement work that you do with school kids. I just wanted to know that when you make these comics or the games for them, who are the creators? Are the adolescents themselves a part of the creation team, or is it the adults?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Exactly, yeah. So you're right, we work with a design company. So this is not science for me. You know, I would never even try my hand at this. So we work with game designers as a company. This particular work was done by a company called Quicksand, which is a company based in Bangalore, Delhi, and Goa. And they design the game. All game designers, by the way, for them this idea of co-production is very old hat. They're surprised when scientists come, oh, you must work with young people. They say, but how else do you design something then, you know? If you don't work with them, they won't use it. So, I mean, we are always the last to understand the human population. So yes, it's always with co-production. So they bring them into a room, they do storyboarding and all of that. You know, the stuff that, these are words that I also learned by watching. But yes, you get professionals to do it.
There's a question from student there, yeah.
Hello. So, very simple. The answer, probably not. How do we destigmatize the topic of mental health? Because be it in a workplace environment or in schools or in colleges or even in research institutions like CCMB, the topic is a stigma. How do we, or we as students or even faculty, how can we work towards destigmatizing it?
Okay, that's a simple question with a very tough answer. So the first thing is to recognize that stigma has a source. It doesn't arise out of thin air. And I always give the example of leprosy. I give that example. Many of you young people may not remember this disease. But leprosy was one of the most feared diseases in society. And it was feared because it was not treatable. And it was feared because when you had leprosy, you were removed from your home and you were placed in some kind of distant place in a little, what do they call, leprosariums. These don't exist anymore now, but they used to be outside the village. People were taken and they were just left out there. We did the same with mental illness and continue to do that, which is we remove people from their communities and stick them in asylums. This is, by the way, a 150-year-old story. When people go to asylums, they often disappear forever. And when they come back as completely changed individuals, oftentimes because they have been very heavily medicated. Our laws until very recently stripped people with mental illness of basic citizenship rights. For example, I don't know how many of you are aware that mental illness until recently was a legitimate ground for divorce. mental illness was a legitimate ground not to inherit wealth on par with your siblings. So we dehumanized people because of their mental illness. We removed their citizenship rights. Why wouldn't you be scared to have mental illness if that is in fact what society and history has done for the mentally ill? Why wouldn't you be scared to have leprosy? So the way to address it is, as with leprosy, you need social action, but you also need good treatment. You need good care that is humane, care that is community-oriented, care, for example, that would be provided in CCMB, and you need an open conversation about mental illness in the same way that we've seen open conversations about HIV/AIDS also challenge the stigma about that disease. So HIV/AIDS is another good example. In 1993, the first man with HIV/AIDS in India, who I knew well, Dominic D'Souza, who has since died, he was in Goa. When he was discovered to be infected, what did the Goa government do? They put him in a quarantine. No nurse would go into the room to give his medicines. They would give the medicines in a little plate, open the door and shove it in and close. Of course, there were no antiretrovirals in those days because they thought that he was going to infect them. This is, of course, the kind of stigma that we had around HIV/AIDS back in the 1990s. We don't have that stigma anymore. Why? Because there's been a very concerted campaign, there's legal rights, there is very good treatment available, etc. And I think those are some of the lessons we need to also draw for mental health. But most importantly, I'll tell you, our program on public engagement is to get young people to share their stories and remove the idea that talking about mental health means you have a mental illness. That is the other important issue, you know. You can talk about mental health in the positive way in the same way you talk about physical health. Think about it. When you talk about physical health, you're not thinking about sickness. You're thinking about positive things. I want to be fit. I want to be able to run the marathon. I want to feel good about my body. These are the kinds of conversations we should also be having about our mental health.
So, what is that lacking in the teachers or say who spend more than half of the day with the students, and that is they're being compensated by the counselors that you are like focusing on? So can you please elaborate on that?
So the question is about the teachers?
Yes, the teachers who spend more than half of the day with the students. So what is that is lacking from the teacher's side to understand the health of the students, and what is that is being complemented by the counselors?
So see, I can only comment about the schools I work in. The teachers do a thankless job. I take my hats off to them because they are working in the most difficult environments I've ever seen. A single teacher in classes with 60 kids teaching every subject from the 6th standard to the 10th standard. I cannot even imagine how a single human being can do it. So I would never blame a teacher for being inadequate. In fact, on the contrary, I think the teachers are doing the most valiant job I've ever seen in government schools in India. Instead, I wish we were able to provide more teachers, that teachers could also be able to look after their own well-being. I actually am convinced that many of these teachers are themselves extremely unhappy about their work life, and that they often get angry with their students, but I'll tell you what, if I had to teach in those kind of environments, I'd probably get angry too. I think we're all human beings finally. If we're pushed to the edge with this kind of workload, I think each and every one of us would have a breaking point. So the way I see the counselor is relieving some of that load for the teachers. For us, the counselor is another human resource in the school. If the teacher's struggling with one of those kids in the class, rather than burden the teacher with trying to fix that struggle on top of everything else they're doing, the counselor can perhaps offer some additional guidance to help that student, struggle less. So that's how I see it. They're really partners. They're not trying to make up for an inadequate teacher. They're trying to complement a very tough job for those teachers. Here.
Thank you so much for that very fascinating talk. I really enjoyed it. So my question pertains to those nested circles which you showed in terms of environments that lead to mental health problems in children, in young adults. And you spoke a lot about those who have been affected by these problems, but I was curious whether you have worked and whether there are any policy directions to address the environments themselves and those who create and perpetuate those environments, sometimes without even knowing that they're doing so. Is that part of your treatment or your interventions as well?
If I was a politician, yes. This is outside the role of a humble scientist. I wish if scientists had the power to actually change society, then, well. Anyway, I know. All I can do is I can basically share these findings with policymakers, but, this is a societal issue, how the world we've created. And mind you, this is not just in India, because as I said, this is happening in many countries around the world. Why it's happening, who the hell knows? I do worry. I mean, say 5 years ago, if I was giving this talk, I would have said, I don't think we have evidence, for example, about social media. Today, I'm more circumspect. I work with an amazing group of neuroscientists at Harvard who are working on social media and the impact it has on the developing brain. And I'm increasingly concerned by the evidence that I'm seeing. And these changes are not just soft changes in terms of neurocognition, but structural changes. And structural change in the brain, I mean. So these are things that I believe we are only just beginning to come to grips with, that the developing brain in the first 2 decades, if it is so sensitive to stimuli like substances, like social factors, then why are we not surprised that it is also sensitive to stimuli like social media, which is a totally transformative kind of stimulus. In fact, if you think about this, consider, this is one example that just tells you how our brains are being faced with exposures that they never had before. The whole role of the memory circuits in the brain is to be able to register information, to encode the information in neurons and neural circuits in ways that you can then actually access that information when you need it. And there are a whole range of evolutionary paradigms like associative learning and so on. Now comes Google or Google Maps. And just ask yourself, can you map your way around cities anymore? You can't. I can't. Even in Delhi, if I have to drive somewhere where I've done 10 times, I'll still probably put on my Google Maps just to make sure I don't get lost. It is a dependence on a particular new form of guidance and information that in some ways is actually meaning that a part of our brain that has developed over millennia to keep this information is becoming redundant. And you know what happens to redundant biology, right? It just basically disappears. And so there are some races, and I'm making it sound pretty scary, but I do think that these are things that are happening. The way we remember things, the way we map physical spaces, the way we catalog information in our brains, all of this is now being undone or reviewed in the face of social media. So I think that's one factor. The other big factor I'll tell you is, of course, the way societies are becoming unequal. And the impact that's having on social fabric of society everywhere. This is a global phenomenon, and I think that is also something that young people are worried about. And the third is climate change. And if you look at in India, I don't see so much climate change action, but in the West there's a lot. In terms of schools, entire schools being shut down and kids out on the street and marching to parliaments everywhere, etc. So I do think that we are seeing an age of youth anger around many of these issues as well.
So,
Okay, Amitya.
talk. Thank you very much. I just want to know, how do the people play the role where we young people didn't enter till now of finding the demarcation line of pressure, giving pressure. I mean, if be it parents or bosses or scientists, whoever it is, if you don't give pressure, students might get off track. Or if you give pressure, that sometimes might help them to excel, be it parents or bosses or whoever. So how do those people find what is the optimum line that we should give pressure up to this level, but we should not exceed this?
No, I wish I knew if I knew the answer to that, I would have a company. Yeah.
Okay, last question.
So I will just simply say, any pressure for a young adult is bad. Guidance, support, providing a scaffolding through which young people can make the decisions that they need to make in their best self-interest is the way that one should actually think about how we relate to young people. It's different from being a child. Children do need a lot more firm guidance. But when you're 20 years old, what you just need is an enablement, a kind of an environment in which you're being listened to, where if needed you are being guided, being given advice, but certainly no pressure.
Last question by Purni.
Hi, thank you for the lecture, sir. I just have a small question. Recently there was a woman kind of psychological lecture which went on and which was circulated amongst CCMB. So like that, could you develop any questionnaire for the teenage or the adolescent kids who are there so that the parents can understand that, okay, my child is under stress?
Yeah, so there are, I got asked this, the earlier question was, are there any biomarkers for mental ill health? There aren't, but in fact, so the only thing we really have are these sorts of questionnaires. These are validated symptom questionnaires that ask about a range of different distressing emotional experiences, and that you score them, and then using an algorithm, you can actually arrive at and saying, your child has a very high risk of having a mood problem. That's all we have currently.
I mean to ask that it's in whatever you have taken scenarios are all from a government school setup, but that's not the story alone. Even international school kids do have their stress levels.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So do we have any questionnaire for the children? Is what?
Yeah, it's the same question. It doesn't matter which school you're in. The questionnaire would be the same. These are universal measures of mental health. And you're absolutely correct. Actually, you know what? The only reason I work in government schools is because they're the least well resourced. But that doesn't mean to say that kids in private schools don't have problems as well. They just have better resources, the classes are smaller, they have more teachers, so there's more parent involvement, etc. So, you have to start somewhere, and so I kind of think my guiding principles start where the need is the greatest.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I have two questions. I'll take the privilege. So you talked about the children and the adolescents and a lot of recipes for the parents and the grown-up people. Do you think that the parents or the grown-up people, when they work in two kind of very diverse atmospheres, like say for example, I work in a lab which is very stressful, and then managing my colleagues, my lab mates, colleagues, everybody, and then go home and then be in a very different atmosphere, and then do you think the time that we spend in this kind of a stressful atmosphere to taking it to the home, does that have some sort of a consequences on the mental health of the elderly or middle-aged people?
No, definitely. If you take your worries home, it's going to affect people at home. But I think what you're speaking about, Giriraj, is why do you have worries in the workplace at all? I do think that, and now I'm turning, of course, to my fellow faculty here. I have to say, since I joined Harvard Medical School, I have realized how important it is for the institutional culture, for example, to be a place where the wellness of faculty, students, and staff are actually promoted. The president of Harvard University, Lawrence Bacow, has made it a kind of a mission that every single member of the university, from the people who are cleaning the offices to himself and every student, is part of a community where people trust each other, where there is zero place for bullying, for any kind of harassment, where there's a whole set of scaffolding for people who have difficulties to be able to access help. It's quite amazing, Giriraj, because I do think that this kind of leadership that actually seeks to see the workplace as a microcosm of the world, where you can actually, when you come to work, you look forward to come to work, you enjoy being there, and actually therefore take your positive spirit back home. How do we create those kinds of workplaces is what I think is a challenge for people like all of us who work in universities and institutions such as CCMB. I know it can be done, and I have never felt happier in my life than I have in the last last 2.5 years at Harvard, where I've really felt that I am a cherished member of the team. But not only that, the way I've been, just through looking at how people behave with one another, I have taken home lessons how I need to behave with the cleaner when she comes to take the garbage out of my room. How do I behave with my junior research assistant? It's just lessons on how you deal with one another in a respectful way, which I think we can learn a lot from.
Well, I must say that CCMB is a privileged place where we really treat each individual with the respect that deserves. But my last question that, we have people from very young age to elderly people, and we interact with all of them. What sort of some useful messages that you would like to give to all of us that we should try to execute?
So I'll tell you a message. I just finished reading a book on the flight here called The Soul of Care. It's been written by my mentor, Arthur Kleinman, and it's a very moving book, actually. It's a story. It's his personal narrative of caring for his wife, who I'd also had the privilege of meeting before she died. She suffered from Alzheimer's disease. I'd strongly recommend this book to you, by the way. It's a very powerful book about caregiving, and I think the one message I will leave you all with is the one that I took away from the book, that when you care for others, you care for yourself. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Vikram, and it's always a privilege to say that you delivered the talk that I was expecting. Thank you very much, Vikram.
Thank you. Thanks, Vikram.
My colleague scientist, Dr. Archana Shiva, and Ms. Nupur Rani Prasad to come over the dais, please. And may I request director to come on the dais, please, Dr. Rakesh Mishra.
Leave the bag there, yeah.
Excellent. Yes. Yeah, we have now the release of CCMB annual report for the year 2018-19. I request the chief guest, Professor Patel, and Director CCMB to release the annual report.